Well, hello and welcome. Thanks so much for attending virtually our session on emerging policy and practice issues. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Steve Schooner at the George Washington University Law School. And I have to say, it's quite strange recording this. It's even stranger than doing a live virtual session because, frankly, throughout my professional career, the year in review week has been when the community has come together. It's a week where you get to see your old friends, your former colleagues, for me, former students. And now this is just another pandemic void. More importantly, as I think you'll see once we get going, there were a tremendous number of changes this year since we submitted our printed materials. Frankly, I feel like our crystal ball has failed us. There's a lot going on, but the good news is, once again this year, I'm joined by Dave Berteau.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everybody. I have to say, you almost sum up the entire year by what you just said. We're used to doing this in front of everybody where we can, I can say, raise your hand if you think this is the last shutdown we're ever going to have. And we can't do that now, right? But certainly in my world at the Professional Services Council, where, our goal is to help make the government a smarter customer and a better buyer. The pandemic has given us both challenges and opportunities to do that. I think that's the theme that you're going to see throughout our presentations today. Back to you, Steve.
So one thing that didn't make it into our materials, and frankly, one thing that is unrelated to the presidential transition, maybe one of the most significant for some of you, is on January 14th, the FAR Council implemented rules further reining in the use of LPTA, or lowest price technically acceptable source selection. For anyone who's been to this conference, Dave and I have been bemoaning over reliance on LPTA for years. And when you now look at the language at FAR 15.101(2)(c), you'll see that there's a number of reasonable constraints on using LPTA, in addition to papering the record, which should be pretty familiar from DOD's recent experience. You're not supposed to use LPTA unless the agency has the ability to comprehensively and clearly describe their minimum requirements in terms of performance objectives, measured standards, or acceptability of offers. The agency shouldn't use LPTA unless they would realize no or minimal value from a proposal that exceeds the minimum requirements. The agency should only use LPTA when they believe that the technical proposals would require no or minimal subjective judgment by the source selection authority as to the desirability of one proposal over another. But here's the other one. The agency is only supposed to use LPTA when they have a high degree of confidence that reviewing the technical proposals of all the offers would not result in the identification of characteristics that might provide value or benefit to the agency. Now, also implicit in this is a nod to life cycle cost and total cost of ownership, but we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. But overall, a year where, frankly, a lot of water is under the bridge. David?
And just one more thing on LPTA. We've asked the heads of contracting authority in a number of agencies, because DOD has its own DFARS clause issued happily on my birthday back in 2019, and now the FAR clause is out. And we've asked agencies, how are you going to ensure compliance with the standards that are laid out and documentation that you've considered those if you in fact choose to do a low price technically acceptable contract? It won't surprise you, Steve, that the answer we've gotten back is we're not, right? We're going to expect that that's going to be done. And in somewhat of an offhanded way, they might say, we're expecting you, David, and your members to raise this issue if in fact it's not being done well. That's not atypical, but it is a responsibility. I think that we're not quite out of the woods yet. Speaking of not out of the woods, let me talk a little bit about the first item here, the year we won't soon forget, right? When we got together a year ago, none of us anticipated that within a few weeks we'd be working from home, and then 11 months later we'd still be working from home.
With no end in sight, right?
That's right. That's right. And not know exactly when this is going to end. But there have been a number of very significant positive results from this in the government contracting business. Number one, if you go back to March and you know, when the federal government initially said, let's have the civilians work remotely if they can, what we immediately heard from contracting officer after contracting officer is, oh, remote working, teleworking is not authorized under your contract. Why? Because in most cases, we didn't think we were going to need to do it. But the idea of having to go through contract by contract to create that authority struck us as not a very good plan for dealing with COVID-19. So we worked with OFPP. We got a great memorandum on March 20th signed by the Deputy Director for Management of OMB, Margaret Weichert, one of the last things she did before she left the federal government. That had a host of things that it authorized. But one of the things it did was it put an affirmative responsibility on program managers and contracting officers to maximize the amount of teleworking that their contractors could do. There's plenty of work you can't do. There's a lot of touch labor work, a lot of access to classified systems, lab work, et cetera, that doesn't come into that. But wherever possible, maximize that. And it took effect almost immediately. And it's had very powerful lasting effects across the federal government, right? Second thing that happened is shortly thereafter, the CARES Act was passed, right? And the CARES Act had a lot of objectives, you know, paycheck protection program, you know, supplemental payments to individuals, but it also had some considerations about contracts and contracting. And one in particular, Section 3610 of the CARES Act, took account of those workers who couldn't do their work from home, but for whatever reason, COVID-related reason, also couldn't do it from the workplace. You've got a SCIF that was not designed to have everybody 6 feet apart from one another, or didn't have ventilation in place, right? And so what was necessary was a recognition that these are not people we want to quit. These are people we'd like to keep on the payroll. But if they can't work, how do you pay them, right? And so what 3610 did is it authorizes contracting officers and programs, subject to available funds, to reimburse companies for the cost of putting such skilled workers or key personnel on paid time off when they couldn't access the facility and couldn't do the work from home. And tens of thousands of people have been kept on the payroll, not paid month by month, week by week throughout the whole year, but when necessary. That authority's been extended twice, once to December 11th into the CR and once to March 31st under the last COVID bill. It will expire March 31st. And one of the big challenges is what's the vehicle for renewing that authority? It's probably something that has been used less in some recent months, but maybe used more in future months. You tell me what the variants are going to do. You tell me how fast the vaccines are going to come out. I'll tell you how much we need it. It's that level of engagement that you've seen. The third thing is that we saw the procurement community across the board in almost every federal agency respond quickly to the need for changing things faster. Now, sometimes it's not necessarily what we want, but for instance, rather than go through the entire rulemaking process to put a defarce clause or a FAR clause change, issue class deviations almost overnight with input from industry as part of that process, right? This is a kind of behavior that you would like to see, frankly, a lot of the times. And later on, we'll talk a little bit about OTAs and the ability to issue contracts without regard to the FAR. You know, part of me would say, hey, if you're going to make this easy for some people, why not make it easier for everybody? Well, under COVID-19, we saw a high emphasis being placed on let's figure out what we need to do to keep the government going, to keep the companies working, to keep the employees on the payroll, to keep the business moving of the government moving. And we saw a lot of that come into play. Now, let me talk a little bit, and I'll shift back to you in a minute, Steve. Let me talk a little bit about the new administration, right? So obviously, when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you get a change in administration, and one of the key issues of the campaign was that pandemic that you're in the middle of, you'd expect some rapid changes, right? Big one, vaccines. I don't know if you've checked lately, how many of you on this call are trying to get a vaccine, but it ain't easy. It ain't easy. But in the world of contracts and contracting, big questions have come up, right? Where do contractors fit in the essential worker categories, right? If you look at what happened back in March, when we first all went to work from home, the Department of Homeland Security in its memorandum, come out of CISA, the Center for Infrastructure and Security Agency, put out a memorandum that says, here's the 16 categories of essential workers in America. Contractors, by and large, were included in those essential workers. That was under CISA's memo. DOD put out its own memo, again, on that March 20th date, that says, here's all the categories of DoD workers that are covered under that. Companies were able to use those memos with a cover letter to the state trooper that stopped you as you were driving down the highway when you were supposed to be home. And you said, I'm sorry, I'm an essential worker. I got to get to the workplace, right? Now we're seeing that same dynamic with vaccines. Who is in the essential workforce? We're not yet in the category 2 where essential workforce is, but when we get there, what part of the contracted community is part of that essential workforce? Do we want that determined on a state-by-state basis? That's where it's going right now. Do we want to determine on a contract-by-contract basis? That's even harder, right? What we really need to do is to look at the broader picture of getting the vaccines out. Big priorities for this administration. A lot of other priorities this administration is coming into play. I'll cover some of those later on in the conversation here. Over to you, Steve.
So taking a step back, one of the other things that didn't make it into our materials, because frankly, we couldn't have anticipated, was the flurry of activity, particularly executive activity, that followed the administration. Dozens of executive orders and other actions in the first couple of days following the January inauguration. Now, to put this in context, remember that just 4 years ago, there was a totally different approach. At the beginning of the prior administration, we talked about the fact that that administration's primary regulatory approach was one of deregulation. And indeed, just 4 years ago, we were at the podium talking about what it would mean to attempt to implement a 2-for-1 reduction with regard to regulations. Now, the 2-for-1 issue probably never played out, but it was not so long ago that we experienced, in effect, the least amount of FAR change or update activity in a single year at any time in the post-FAR era, dating back to April Fool's Day, 1984. So one of the things we have to come to grips with is dramatic volume and pace of change. And some of this is just pent up NDAA and other activity, but lots and lots of change after a period where things moved relatively slowly at the beginning. 2 relatively small things, not terribly significant at the federal level, but could be interesting to watch. The incoming administration has made very clear they do not plan to continue construction of the southern border wall. What will be interesting is to see what happens to the existing contracts on the southern border wall. There have been media reports that a number of them contain significant termination penalties. So it'll be interesting whether those are straight out cancellations, terminations for convenience, or whether it's cheaper just to continue them rather than reallocate those funds. Another one, just to kind of show you an issue that we looked at 4 years ago, at the end of the Obama administration, the Department of Justice at the federal level got out of the business of private prisons. When the Trump administration came in, the day of the inauguration, no stock went up faster than private prison stock. But again, with this new administration, we are seeing a very clear statement that the federal government will not continue to award private prison contracts, but at least so far, we've not seen any clear signal that they will cancel or terminate any of those existing contracts. But of all of the recent churn, possibly the one that may have the greatest concern or focus for our community is the domestic preference executive order issued on January 25th. That's Executive Order 14005, if I'm correct. And the most significant changes have to deal with what we often refer to as rules of origin, or in other words, an increase in the domestic content. Now, we're going to see generally for manufactured items and also for steel and related items, how much of a difference 5% makes. So, for example, 50 to 55%. But frankly, as we look at this today, the biggest wild card in the executive order is what the value added test really means. And for that, we're simply going to have to wait to see what the FAR Council does with it. There's also a commercial information technology exception, and that'll be an interesting one to watch as well. Now, I briefly want to mention 2 things that were in the materials that we anticipated would become big issues that may be even more significant issues than we expected, and that's infrastructure and sustainable procurement. As most of you realize, the United States is in a relatively unique situation because at the federal level, we haven't invested in infrastructure for many, many years. We have what some people refer to as crumbling infrastructure, but we do need to make investments. But most of this work plays out at the state and local level. For the last 4 years, the administration said they would focus on infrastructure, and it to some extent became somewhat of a running joke that this week would be infrastructure week. Now, here's the interesting policy thing. The prior administration, I think, actually believed that they were going to get infrastructure investment driven by the private sector. There was a lot of talk about public-private partnerships. The problem is we're almost a full generation behind the rest of the world in the evolution of public-private partnerships, and there's probably no better example for people in the DC area than to have watched what happened with the Purple Line in Maryland. But historically in this country, it's the government that drives infrastructure. The clear message from the new administration and the Secretary of Transportation is that there will be major investments in infrastructure, and those investments are going to take into account the impact on climate change. Again, a lot of this activity will take place at the state and local or regional level through grants. We'll talk a little bit more about grants later. But on that topic, it seems to me that other than cybersecurity, and we'll touch on that a little bit later as well, my personal prediction is that for most of you, sustainable procurement is about to become the single biggest topical change for us and the next generation of procurement professionals. And unlike other transactions, which we'll talk about, it's not solely going to be a tool for the innovators and the people on the cutting edge. It's going to be part of our everyday work, even though for many, they're not familiar with the topics. So my prediction is that over the next 4 years, agencies are going to need to show the kind of progress on sustainable procurement that agency heads feel they have to demonstrate annually to Congress with regard to, for example, small business participation. Now, as you'll see in the materials, I discussed some of these issues in an October article in Contract Management Magazine. But just for context, it's hard to remember that back in 1996, until the FAR Part 15 rewrite, there was language in FAR 15605B, that's FAR 15605B, such that environmental objectives were a required source selection evaluation, just like price and past performance. But that dropped out in the late 1990s. Since that time, we've seen a proliferation of executive orders and other guidance on climate change and environmental issues, but they've been very, very complex, and it's been easy to ignore them. My feeling is going forward, the only way we're really going to change behavior with regard to sustainable procurement is if we can overcome the tyranny of low price. The problem that we have is that historically fossil fuel solutions have been directly or indirectly subsidized for decades, and existing solutions and legacy solutions tend to be the path of least resistance, which makes innovation really hard. So I think we're going to see a fair amount of pressure on GSA, particularly with regard to the schedules, to offer and highlight more green products. But much more broadly, I think the real challenge is going to be putting more pressure on contracting officers to think harder and longer about life cycle cost, total cost of ownership, or total ownership cost. The only way you can do sustainable procurement is if you think about what economists call externalities, whether negative or positive. Not necessarily what you're paying for, but what are the unintended consequences or the things that follow from the procurement rather than what's delivered. Now, in the modern vernacular, increasingly you're seeing the economists not use the word externalities, but instead use the word effects. And frankly, if you like that kind of thinking, I highly recommend Kate Raworth's book called donut economics. But the challenge that contracting officers are going to have to answer going forward, and contractors are going to have to answer in their proposals, is how much more do we have to pay, or how much more does the customer pay for a solution that gives us less emissions, carbon reduction, or a more efficient outcome? But frankly, I think that's going to be a sea change of activity. All right, now, completely changing gears. One thing that you're going to see in this year's material is there is a lot of information with regard to data. And the big headline for last year is cracking the $600 billion threshold. And the question is that a peak? Is that a blip? Or is that going to be a trend? Okay, this is a lot to take in on the slide. Obviously, it's in your materials as well. A number of things I want you to focus on, and I'll show it to you graphically in a different way in just a moment. But one of the things that I've been very frustrated for years is that FPDS, the Federal Procurement Data System, which of course has since transitioned into SAM as well, and then later usaspending.gov, has become less and less accessible. Or in other words, it has become harder and harder year after year for mere mortals, let alone experts, to get access to basic procurement information. Last year, we put a lot less of this information in the materials. This year, we threw in the towel and we went and got professional help. So in addition to all the materials we have here, if you look on your screen, we turned to the Pulse of Government Contracts that did a massive data crunching effort for us, and they summarized some of this with additional information in something they called A Decade in Federal Discretionary Spending, and the link is right there, and obviously it's in your materials as well. But before I leave the slide, just look at some of the differences that you see in terms of how procurement spending has gone up, how grant spending has gone up, and how cumulative discretionary spending has gone up. All right, let me say just a couple more words about this before I turn it back to David. All right, let's look at the procurement spending only in terms of the deadline, and here are the things I want you to focus on. 20 years ago, not that long in terms of dog years or whatever, but when we hit the new millennium, we were spending about $200 billion a year in procurement. Okay? That seems like a relatively significant number. No, we didn't think of it as low at the time, but that seemed like where we were in terms of somewhat of a plateau. For a number of reasons in the early 2000s, from everything from storms to wars abroad, that spending exploded until we hit our plateau with the recession around 2008. The interesting thing, particularly as the numbers have been adjusted over time, is the numbers didn't fall immediately. There was an extremely stable recession-related plateau from 2008 to 2010, at which time procurement spending did start falling, and it dropped all the way down until in fiscal year 2015, we had literally fallen more than $100 billion from the peak around 2008 to 2010. But then again, the numbers start going up. And before the last administration and throughout the last administration, those numbers climbed and climbed and climbed until we finally exceeded the $600 billion plateau. Now, this is important. I know that at least some of you are thinking, but isn't that just an increase that correlates with inflation? And the answer is no. The dramatic difference in this increase in spending to inflation is something that's worth discussing. Obviously, many of you recall that from 2001 to 2008, federal procurement spending went up at orders of magnitude more than the rate of inflation. Then, of course, it dipped again, but again, the growth demonstrates that this is not just that things cost a little bit more. Okay, now, as I turn it back over to David, one of the things that we wanted you to focus on is that different agencies receive more money or spend more money at different times. We could focus on any number of them, but we don't have time to focus on the things like, well, of course, the Department of Commerce is spending more because we've got a census to deal with. But if you look at this chart, what you'll see is, gee, it actually is rather interesting how stable some agencies are and how dramatically some other agencies change. So, David, did you want to talk to this one, or should I go straight to the next slide?
We'll go to the next one.
Okay.
Mindful of the time here, you know, if we had our book in front of us, we'd say, all right, we're going to page 9-14 right now. One of the great things we miss is where's the big blue book? Okay. So let me come back now to where that money comes from, right? Because in the end, you can't put a contract out unless the dollars have been appropriated, right? So I'm looking here at contract obligation trends. I'm going to go through these slides. I got 3 slides here. Let me orient you very quickly. What you have is this is government-wide total contract obligations for each fiscal year by quarter. So FY16 on the left, FY20 the last year for which we have full data, obviously, on the right-hand side. First quarter is the dark blue at the bottom. Fourth quarter is the kind of ochre at the top, right? And you see 2 interesting things here. One, not surprisingly, more money is spent in the fourth quarter of the fiscal year in terms of contract obligations than any other quarter. But there's an anomaly here. And that is FY19, where you see actually a big jump in the first quarter compared to the previous years, even though, as you'll see on a later slide, it was the same amount of appropriated funds. Why? Because for 75% of the federal government, DOD, HHS, VA, labor, education, and energy, they started the fiscal year with a full year appropriations in place, not a CR. And you'll see a big jump when we look at the DOD slide coming forward. The second thing you see, look at the top. You see 8% per year, 9% per year, 8% per year, 11% per year. Budgets were going up, contract obligations were going up. They lagged a little bit, not surprising. In fact, part of the reason that trough on your other slide, Steve, was 15 instead of 13 sequester year is it takes a couple of years for the flow down to actually hit the obligations themselves because you're obligating prior year funds. Let me go to the next slide. This is government-wide. The next slide is DOD. Now here you got bigger jumps, 9%, 12%, 11%, 7% in contract dollars, right? But look at the first quarter of FY19, where DOD went from 75 billion in the first quarter of 18 to 111 billion, 112 billion in the first quarter of FY19 with the same level of appropriations, right? So what happens when you get rid of a CR? You actually spread your contracts out more effectively over the course of the year. You use your contracting officers and your programs more diligently over the course of that time. You get what you buy earlier in the process. The government every year talks about the negative impact of a CR, or sometimes many of you represent agencies or work for agencies who say, we've learned how to adjust to a CR. We don't need to worry about the impact of a CR. This shows you do. We have not learned how to adjust to CR. What we should be learning how to do is how to adjust to a full year appropriation on time. In FY20, you saw it come back down a little bit, not nearly as much as it would be otherwise, but that's largely driven by 2 large contract obligations, one for a very well-known aircraft where lots 11 and 12 were both awarded, and the other for a big chunk of ships, right? You take those out, you're back down to the FY19 levels. Let's look at the other side, the civilian agency side. Next slide, please. The civilian agencies tell a little bit of a different story. First of all, you'll notice I actually have first quarter FY21 data here already. DOD doesn't release data until it sat on it for 90 days. Before I went back into the government in the middle of the last decade, I thought they actually did something during those 90 days. I went into DOD and discovered they don't do anything at all. They just sit on it. Why not give us the data? That's going to be one of my initiatives for FY21, for 22. But look at the difference at the top line. 6%, 3%, 3%, and then a big jump, 16% FY20. As you'll see on the later slide, that 3% increase year over year, 17 to 18, that 3% increase in contract obligations, 18 to 19, was not nearly commensurate with the increase in actual appropriated dollars that those agencies received. Civilian agencies in the aggregate got a 12% jump in each of those 2 years. They did not move the money into contracts. So part of what you saw, Steve, when you talked about changes early on in the administration is defense got its increase in money and actually moved it into contracts, 11%, 12%, 13% on the previous slide. Civilian agencies got their money and did not obligate it. We don't have the data. Not only do you not get the data you used to be able to get out of FPDS, it turns out you can't get the data out of OMB you used to get either. So we no longer have a track of how many dollars expired unobligated from the accounts each given year. But I would submit to you that if you got 12% more money and you only obligate 3% more of that money, you're not spending all of your money. Now, there's a lot of associated factors come into play there. So that's on the civilian side. Let's go to the next slide.
I think the next one might be, I think we have one in between. So let me just say one word about this.
It's back to you to look at the difference between what might be and what is.
Yeah. So one of the things I keep telling my students every year is I really like government contracts, and government contracts have been very, very good to me, but we got to think long and hard about moving into the grants business. If you've been paying attention, federal grant spending has exceeded procurement spending for 17 of the last 19 years. Procurement dollars last exceeded grant spending in 2008. That's a long time ago at this point. So the big growth, and when I say big growth, look at the steepness of the curve, has been in grant spending. But what's also striking is the cumulative growth here. Let me just give you two numbers. Go all the way over to the left side of the chart. Back in 2001, we only spent $553 billion in procurement and grant spending combined. Fast forward to 2020, 1.58 trillion. That's nearly triple the amount. This is not for the faint of heart, but seriously, David, we need to get into the grants business. Okay, here's that other chart.
The previous slide is if you got the increase in money and you didn't obligate it in contracts, and by the way, you also didn't spend it on federal civilians because the last administration had a freeze and was declining federal civilian numbers, maybe it all went to grants, and your slide shows that it does. Meanwhile, we've got a challenge for next year, right? So all of us have lived for the last decade under the Budget Control Act caps, and that's what this chart shows you. You go all the way back to FY12, that was the first year of the caps. The blue down at the bottom is the cap for defense. That black in the middle is OCO, and there's a little bit of numbers at the top for OCO, for civilian OCO, but they're so small that all you can see is the number. You can't actually see the bar. And the orange at the top is civilian agency caps. So there's two caps, defense and non-defense, right? Look at what's happened to those caps most recently, right? In fact, starting in FY16 and 17, you got a big bump. 18 and 19, you got a really big bump, 15% for DOD, 12% for civilian agencies. 20 and 21, you got a smaller bump for DOD, about 5%, and about 7% for civilian agencies. The caps end in FY21, right? And so that BBA 19 is the level of caps for FY21, and that's essentially, we didn't have a signed appropriation when we figured it in because the president waited until the last minute, appropriations bill for FY21, but they appropriated basically at the caps. Those caps are no longer in play for FY22 and FY23, the two right-hand bars on this chart here. They've got big question marks there. What's happened over time is the caps, which were a ceiling, also became the floor. Whatever the administration proposed, you can see that PB21 column, third from the right, that's what the administration proposed in its budget for FY21. And you can see it was about $50 billion below the caps, but Congress appropriated to the caps. The caps were the ceiling. The caps were also the floor. For FY22, we have no ceiling, but we also have no floor. There is no agreed upon number for defense or for civilian agencies, either across the Congress from one house to the other, between the parties from Democrats to Republicans, within the administration. They inherited some numbers, but they haven't decided what their numbers are. We are only 8 months away, 8 months and 2 weeks away, 8 months and a week by the time you watch this, away from the start of fiscal year 22. And no one has any idea how much appropriations will be available or when we're going to come to that point, right? Hopefully we'll get a 2-year deal. Hopefully that deal will be a cap that turns into a floor, or at least a target that turns into both a ceiling and a floor. And hopefully we'll get that deal before August 1st, which is the date that the debt ceiling returns. And the past, Steve, we haven't talked too much about that. Why? Because Treasury has all these extraordinary measures that will allow you to extend the time period between the debt ceiling occurring and default occurring for months, it seems like. But we're totally untested In fact, you and I didn't actually talk about this in putting together the material because it was last year. We weren't thinking about the debt ceiling, which wasn't until August of next year. But how long will those extraordinary measures carry you when you're running $3, $4, $5 trillion a year deficits? Untested, unknown. One of the big priorities is going to be, let's get a budget deal or we're going to have a real problem come August, September, October. Let me turn back to you for the next slide.
So one more statistical thing that we wanted to point out before we move away from numbers to start talking about some other things. And that is, look, like everyone else, we've been talking about OTs, other transactions, OTA, other transactions authority for many, many years. But what I want you to focus on with this chart is OTs have been interesting and exciting and innovative, but they haven't been statistically significant. They've been pilots and models and examples. But if you look across the bottom of that chart, we're still talking less than $2 billion a year in OTs through 2016, less than $2 billion. We're not even at half of 1% of federal procurement. Well, finally, 2018, 2019, 2020, we actually see a little bit of increase at this point. Now, let's be clear. The volume of other transaction activity increasingly rises or is increasing dramatically, but at the end of the day, it is still not statistically significant in terms of the total federal procurement landscape. So for the experts and the innovators, this is really important. But OTs are not a way of doing business for our everyday procurement professional. The question is what's going to happen with this trend line over time? All right, now, go ahead.
Steve, if I can interrupt, data that don't show on that, if you go back to that slide, just one other point, right? Data that don't show in here because they weren't collected in this data system is the DoD's use of OTA for their non-year-based COVID funding. Almost 50% of their awards COVID related, which is not research and technology and innovation. It's essentially buying stuff and prototypes, buying a prototype that you're actually going to use, right? Half that, almost $15 billion in DoD came through OTAs, and it's not reflected in these numbers. That may be a one-time blip, a COVID-related blip. You tell me how long one time lasts on COVID, and I'll tell you whether OTA numbers in 21 will look the same. Back to you, over.
Okay, so one of our favorite things each year, of course, is the Psc Annual Survey, and I'll turn that back over to David. By the way, if you haven't seen the survey, the link is here, but again, we'll let David talk about that.
Right, thank you, Steve. So let's go to the next slide. So we do this survey every other year. We've done it for 20 years now, and this was our 2020 survey, and we survey government acquisition professionals. Not surprisingly, we actually get the same people survey to survey because a lot of these folks do stay in there in the government service, although many of them are in a different job by the time we talk to them the next time around. 5 major themes have emerged out of this in terms of the results of our survey of the senior acquisition executives in DoD. Number one, of course, was COVID-19. Had a huge impact, big impact on both the workforce and a big impact on the workflow, and the general sense that we accommodated and adjusted pretty quickly. I'll give you an example that came up over and over again. We had to send workers home. The government had to send its federal civilians home. And in many cases, they didn't have the software loaded on their laptops issued at the last possible minute that would allow them to, for example, approve an invoice for payment. Well, you can see this could be a real problem pretty quickly because companies are not going to be able to stay in business if they don't get paid. The government did a very good job of identifying those folks who needed to have that software, getting it out to them, getting it loaded, getting it put in place. It obviously raised a lot of other concerns as well. Workforce concerns that grew out of this. And here we see the potential for both a transformation of the workforce and the workforce habits that we have in DoD and across the federal government, and also perhaps a reversion back to what we were before. My suspicion is that if we'd have been able to do a survey a year ago, Steve, when we were standing in front of the entire crowd, and we said, how many of you in your heart of hearts believe that when people are teleworking, they're not quite working as hard as when they're in the office? I suspect that if they could have done it anonymously, a lot of hands would have gone up in that room, right? Probably you thought that way. Probably I thought that way. What have we learned in the last 11 months? We've learned that people work really hard when you get working from home. We've learned that when you work from home, it's very hard to go home from work, right? And so you may work longer. There's a lot of potential implications of this. There's concern about this within the acquisition workforce in two ways. Number one is, are we burning our people out? Are we be able to sustain this, and how long will we need to sustain this? The second is, what does it mean when it comes time to come back? Because what we've discovered is you don't actually have to be in the office to get this stuff done. Whether you're a federal civilian or a contractor supporting, not for everything. There's a lot of work you do have to be at the location, but there's a lot of work where you can work it remotely. Once you're working remotely, does it really matter whether you're in Woodbridge or whether you're in Woodmont? No, it doesn't necessarily, as long as you've got the connectivity and the infrastructure in place. On top of that, though, so you might have recruitment and retention capabilities. You might have some other implications that would come from a new workforce. But how do you bring in new people and inculcate them into your culture? We learned, you and I, Steve, learned in the procurement business from seniors and mentors who were monks in this world, and they knew the technology and they knew the words. You're thinking of far monks like I am, right? Who you could cite a clause and they'd tell you what the number was, right? Anywhere in the FAR. You don't learn that remotely. You don't learn that through search engines, right? And so the workforce things are coming into play. The budget I already covered. This is a widespread concern inside the federal government and the acquisition community. It's not just that we don't know what the number is that we don't know when we will know, right? And so you get a dampening effect on a lot of things because of the uncertainties associated with the federal budget. Data management. There's a big discussion in the report on this, and it's kind of what we call the tale of two cities, right? A lot of data requirements. And by the way, Steve, as you mentioned at the front end, this is likely to go up in the current administration. We want more data from industry, but no willingness to do one of two things. Number one is just get the data you need. Number two is figure out who's going to pay for it, because gathering data and submitting data are not free. You a lot of places where the government has a legitimate interest, a lot of places where they capture data and just put it on a shelf. And then the last theme that came forth was the need for greater communications. And here again, it's hard to separate out communications issues from COVID-19 issues, and we'll continue to pursue this going forward. I think I would urge you all to take a look at the report. It's quick, it's easy to read. You can get some very good comparative data. And of course, we do this every 2 years. So in 2 years, we'll be back here, Steve, and reporting on the 22 biennial acquisition policy survey. Back to you.
Okay, so one of the things that we had done in our materials, again, not knowing what was coming, was we put in a little bit of a wish list, and some of our wishes have been granted and some not. But, we're reminded that the 809 panel kind of went big and may not have gotten everything that they wanted. We figured we would ask for some modest things and see if we could get anything. One of the things that we asked for was the repeal of one of the most controversial executive orders from the last administration, and that was EO 13950, the one on combating race and sex stereotyping. We can put aside the substance of that. Our concern primarily from a procurement standpoint was how that actually impacted contracts and the like. At this point, not only has the executive order been rescinded, but the class deviations at most of the agencies that implemented the executive order are now gone. So if you have contracts that have some of that language in there, solicitations or contract clauses, I think that by sooner rather than later, we would expect to be out of the woods on that particular issue. One long-running issue is the service contracts inventory. Throughout our materials and in David's earlier discussion, we talked a lot about data. Of all of the data calls related to federal procurement, to me, this is one of the most frustrating. It seems to me, particularly in light of GAO's most recent report, the service contract inventory is a data call in search of a purpose. No one knows exactly what they're going to do with the data, and unless the data is going to contribute meaningfully to the procurement process, let's stop wasting everyone's time and money collecting the data. My frustration primarily with the inventory is that at its worst, it can lead to bad policies, because what we want to know is how service contractors are performing. What we're least interested in is how many FTEs are being allocated to that work. Outcomes, not process. Outcomes, not counting heads. That would be great. Another one that, frankly, I've been complaining about for years. It was heartbreaking to watch the Afghan and Iraq visa waiver program for special immigration visas dry up during the last administration. I can't say the administration before that did a great job either. But just to remind folks who haven't followed these issues, there were a lot of third country nationals who really helped support basically everything that the United States military and State Department did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of the most threatened people in those areas were some of the most valuable as contractors. It was impossible for the United States government to perform its missions without people who could speak the language, but those interpreters were highly visible, and frankly, them and their families became targets. So the United States government promised these people that after their service, they would be permitted to emigrate to the United States. And frankly, we've not done a very good job on that promise. I'd really like to see us do more in the future. Dave, you want to say a word about 889?
I will, but before that, Steve, I'll tell you, we're going to give an update on the visa waiver program next year, and we'll see whether or not progress has been restored. So I think it's a moral and a human obligation. And by the way, if we ever want to go somewhere again, our ability to get the support we need will depend on how well we've supported those who helped us last time. So Section 889, most of you are familiar with that. It was a two-part statute. First part took effect August of 2019. Second part took effect August of 2020. And it basically, the second part particularly is the harder one. Every contractor has to certify that they are not using any prohibited products from any of the banned companies, their subsidiaries or affiliates. We could see this coming. Many companies were ready and able to operate. Smaller companies, those that operate in non-US territory, those who operate in rural areas of the US, where in fact the only telephone system available to you has a Huawei piece of equipment in it, have set up a problem. Two issues here that come into play. One is the need for greater security and the threat that the prohibited equipment or the banned companies posed in that regard. And there's very little dispute in the contractor community that security needs to be enhanced and needs to be looked at. But compliance requires two things that the government never provided. One is, what exactly is prohibited? What are the subsidiaries and affiliates from which you can't buy? There's no list been published. There's no provision of any information in that regard. It is up to each company to decide whether or not they have in fact identified that universe and made sure that it either was not in their systems or that they identified it to the government with a mitigation plan in place if it were in their systems. The second thing is, if you find a prohibited piece of equipment in your systems, you have to replace it with something. What's available to replace it? Again, thousands of companies have to go out and create their own market research in which they then have to determine whether this has any prohibited equipment in it or any connection to any banned company. And the government has failed to provide anything in that regard. It's a point we've made over and over again. It is an element of the Buy America executive order, or it should be an element of the Buy American executive order. I predict, Steve, that we'll still be talking about this issue next year when we get together. It may emerge, but it won't decline. So, thank you.
On a far less significant note, we frankly have nothing helpful to report with regard to the Department of Defense JEDI cloud computing contract saga. It's a remarkable saga. There have been multiple protests at GAO and the Court of Federal Claims, appeals to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. There were challenges to the acquisition strategy, particularly the sole source. Lots of conflicts of interest have been alleged involving the major competitors. Frankly, the most interesting recent development with regard to the latest protest in the Court of Federal Claims that's currently pending is that the Defense Department took corrective action, but the court is reviewing that corrective action and other issues. Just recently, the Department of Defense signaled to Congress that if the litigation continues, it may consider other options, but it's unclear exactly what that is. So in that regard, all we really have to do is say, stay tuned on this as well.
Let me make
David.
one observation there, Steve, if I can. There's something a little bit heartbreaking about this, because it's clear that the government in general, and the Defense Department in particular, needs to be able to access the best available technology evolving in the commercial sector to use to support missions and operations whether it's in DoD or anywhere else, although the consequences in DoD are very significant. The challenges of doing that are clearly reflected in this saga and all of the elements that come into play. And I would submit to you that the analysis that have to be done is not just for this one particular RFI and RFP and source selection process. It's for the general principle of how does the government figure out how to buy innovative technology that's coming out of the commercial sector and not take 3 years to do it.
All right. You want to wrap it up, David?
Sure. So final thoughts. We do have a new administration. You know, we're into the second month of that new administration. They set a record for new executive orders and new executive actions within the first, you pick a day, first 3 days, first week and a half. Not only set records, they were as much as their 6 predecessors combined rolled up, right? Let's look at what their 4 priorities are that they say over and over again. Number 1 is tackle COVID-19. Number 2 is deal with climate change. Number 3 is get the economy back. That's actually number 2, because that's one of the ways you tackle COVID change. And number 4 is equity and justice, right? Now, what do those 4 mean for contractors? It's not yet obvious. What does it mean for contracting in the federal government? It's not yet obvious. We're going to see that evolve. Our report card for next year will come back and tie it to these 4 priorities, or we'll conclude that they weren't really priorities after all, and you looked at what they did and told you what their real priorities are. Those are my final thoughts. Thank you, Steve, once again for a great year.
Once again, a pleasure to be here with David Berteau. We look forward to seeing all of you next year.
Hopefully in person.